the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. This week we're joined by a flared user on the subreddit, Trevor Culley, and we are here to talk about the subject of the Cyrus Cylinder. So, I guess just to start off with, because I don't know that our audience will be particularly familiar, what is the Cyrus Cylinder?
So the Cyrus Cylinder is a very descriptively named artifact. It is essentially a clay barrel about a foot long, and it records a declaration from the Persian king Cyrus the Great, the first king and conqueror of the Persian Empire, immediately following his conquest of the city of Babylon. And it is primarily known for how it describes his conquest as peaceful, which is not necessarily a unique bit of ancient propaganda, but it is interesting in that it is corroborated by most of the existing source material.
An initial question is, when are we talking about, and who was Cyrus? Right.
The events of the cylinder are pretty firmly dated to 539 BC, and Cyrus was the king of a little tiny kingdom that you could variously call Persia or Anshan, which I'll get into a little bit more as we go. In around 553, he rebelled against his overlords, who were the Medes, based just north. Anshan was in southwestern Iran, the modern Fars province. The Medes were based out of Ecbatana, north in the modern province of Hamadan, and controlled a swath of territory that stretched from somewhere in central Iran to somewhere in central Anatolia, and the borders bent all around to accommodate a much stronger Babylonian presence in the region. Cyrus rebelled in 553 and had taken over control of the Median Empire from the Median kings by about 550 and went on possibly the greatest conquering spree of any known historical figure up to that point. Several minor kingdoms fell, several areas in eastern Iran came under Persian control that aren't very well documented because most of our source material for this period is Greek, and they just didn't know anything about Eastern Iran. And then there's some of the big ones like Lydia, which was in Western Anatolia, modern Turkey. And finally, Babylon was the last stage of his major conquests. There were some more peripheral things. There was plans for Egypt that never materialized during Cyrus's lifetime. But Babylon was at the center of all of these other westward conquests that he had made over the preceding 20 or so years before he actually took the city. The cylinder itself was produced right around that time and buried in the foundations of a temple in Babylon known as the Esagila, which was the primary temple of the Babylonian high god Marduk, and it basically sat there for the preceding 2,000 years until it was dug up in 1879 by an Assyrian archaeologist named Hormuzd Rassam, working for the British Museum, where it has lived basically ever since.
So what's the significance of placing the cylinder at the Esagila? Was it that it was expected to be read by a lot of people, or was it sort of a text that was created and believed to have a certain value in itself and was placed in the temple in relation to that?
Well, the copy of the cylinder that we have, the one that is actually imprinted on a little clay barrel, was probably intended for the god's eyes only, or at least primarily. It was buried in the foundation stones of the temple when Cyrus sponsored a reconstruction or restoration effort for the temple after a few years of disrepair under the previous king. This was a fairly standard practice in ancient Mesopotamia. In the foundations of the same temple, we've found cylinders from several other Babylonian and Assyrian kings. The most famous one is probably Ashurbanipal of Assyria, who's actually referenced in the Cyrus Cylinder. And similar cylinders are found in temples all over the Mesopotamian region. The Cyrus Cylinder was also copied. We've found fragments of the same text, either from tablet form or other cylinders, in other locations in Babylonia. So this was a text that was read by people, at least the nobility or the priesthoods in ancient Babylonia. But the specific text we have in its complete form, or nearly complete form, was dedicated to the god, and we are lucky that it was, because being buried in the temple foundations is probably what allowed it to survive for so long.
And, that's given us a lot of context for the Cyrus Cylinder, so I suppose it's a good jumping off point into asking, well, what does it say? And what does it say, I guess, about Cyrus and about Babylon at this time? And, of course, there's a lot of specific aspects to this question, and I'm sure we'll spend quite a while on this, so I guess a general overview first, and then we can dig in.
Right. So this is what really makes the Cyrus Cylinder stand out from all of the other ancient Mesopotamian cylinders that we have. Typically, they're very clerical or religious documents invoking the god, saying, I did this, I sponsored that, very straightforward, not typically recording events, or if they do, just kind of referencing them in the context of whatever dedication was being performed around that text. The Cyrus Cylinder is an odd duck in that it contains a narrative. And it contains a narrative because Cyrus was, of course, not the king of Babylon. He had no claim to any tradition up to that point that would give him the right to claim being king of Babylon. In the preceding centuries, kings of Assyria, kings of Babylon, before that, kings of a place called Sealand, all had ties to much, much more ancient Mesopotamian traditions, and they could claim Babylon through right of ancestors from hundreds and even thousands of years past. Cyrus didn't have any of that to speak of, so he kind of had to create it from whole cloth, and that's what the Cyrus Cylinder is describing. It is also reflecting a very unique set of political circumstances in addition to the Persian conquest of Babylonia. And to totally understand where that came from, you have to kind of wind Babylonian history back by more than a decade. The most famous Babylonian empire, the one we sometimes call the Neo Babylonian Empire, which is the one most famously referenced in the Bible, was actually a very short flash in the pan, historically speaking. It was around for about 70 years from the time the Babylonians allied with the Medes to conquer the Assyrian Empire. And under the first two better-known kings of the Neo-Babylonian period, it was a very powerful kingdom. It was prosperous. It conquered all of southern Assyria and slightly beyond, up to the borders with Egypt, where it started having conflicts with the Egyptians. And that went up to the death of King Nebuchadnezzar II. When Nebuchadnezzar died, Babylon kind of went into a downward spiral. There was a series of palace coups and assassinations, and you had 3 kings in almost as many years before this new guy named Nabonidus shows up on the Babylonian throne. He is involved in the assassination of his predecessor, who was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, but we don't really know how Nabonidus ties into the rest of the Babylonian royal family. He might have been a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. He might have been just a high-ranking noble, complete outsider, and there's some prophetic texts from Babylon that kind of imply that he was at least seen as starting a new dynasty. At first, Nabonidus is pretty straightforward. His mother was a priestess of the moon god Sin, but that didn't impact his early reign too much until he tried to expand the Babylonian Empire, and I say tried, but he was successful, into northern Arabia. And he found the oasis city of Tema, which, if it didn't have a temple to the goddess Sin, then at least had a syncretic temple there. And he ended up staying in Tema for a decade while his son Belshazzar was the one running the show in Babylon proper. Of course, spending a decade in an oasis resort, being religiously pious and away from the capital of the kingdoms already starts to sound like a problem. But for Babylon in particular, the king's patronage of the Temple of Marduk and its priests, and his participation in a New Year's ceremony in which he receives the blessing of the god every year, was integral to Babylonian political culture and religion. And preferring to patronize a different god and live hundreds of miles from the temple was seen as a slight and kind of evoking divine wrath and tempting the gods, so to speak, on Nabonidus's part. So that's the political situation in Babylon while Cyrus is busy conquering everyone on their borders. Earlier in Nabonidus's reign, before this excursion to Tema, he had actually treated Cyrus's conquest of the Medes as a good thing. He saw it as defeating a potential threat to Babylon. Hostility had been brewing between the Medes and Babylonians for years, and the implication of some of Nabonidus's inscriptions from the time is that Cyrus's victories were seen as a release valve. But while he was away, Cyrus just kept expanding, and it became increasingly clear that he wasn't going to stop at Babylon's borders. There's even a suggestion from the Greek historian Herodotus that before the invasion of Babylonia proper, Cyrus's generals were already making incursion into Phoenicia, which was considered Babylonian territory at the time. That's not particularly well substantiated in any other record, and Herodotus isn't particularly well known for his reliability in Mesopotamia, but the reference is there. So when Cyrus invades Babylon, or is preparing to invade Babylon, that's kind of what prompts Nabonidus to come home. And when he comes home, he institutes a policy of preparing for the invasion, as any sane king would who doesn't want to lose his throne. But he does it in an interesting way where he takes all of the major temple idols and the priesthoods that maintain them from temples in the cities surrounding Babylon and brings them into the city. There are a lot of different interpretations of this, both in the ancient material and the modern historians' writings. Either, and this is how Cyrus wanted it to be seen, Nabonidus was kidnapping these gods to hold these cities hostage and ensure their loyalty. What's more likely, based on historical precedent, is that Nabonidus was bringing these idols into the city because historically, when someone from southern Iran invaded Babylonia, they would loot all of the temples and take religious icons and idols and treasure back to Iran with them. And historically, that had usually been the Elamites, who more or less occupied the same region as Cyrus at this point. But that wasn't what Cyrus was going for. Obviously, this was not a raid in force. He had already assumed the throne of many kingdoms surrounding his own. This was a war of conquest. And maybe Nabonidus misread that. Maybe it was just a desperate plea for help. It's not clear. The invasion itself is actually not part of the Cyrus Cylinder, which is focused on the events at Babylon itself. But we do have the Babylonian Chronicle for the reign of Nabonidus. And of course, that can't have been written during his reign because it records the end of his reign. So this is actually a document created under Cyrus or his successors. And it records that there was at least one major battle between Nabonidus leading the army and Cyrus's forces outside the town of Opis. The Babylonian army was defeated and forced to retreat, and there is a debate among historians about whether or not Cyrus then invaded and plundered the city, killing the people inside, or slaughtered the soldiers in their camp as they were trying to retreat. The language of the chronicle itself leaves both options entirely valid, and there's kind of two camps of a pro-Cyrus's image and trying to take down this really famous great man figure who try to paint that as, look, he's not quite so peaceful after all. I think either way, there's clearly battles here. It's not an entirely peaceful conquest until he arrives at the walls of Babylon. At which point, we switch to the Cyrus Cylinder and a series of Greek sources that just could not possibly imagine that Cyrus took the city peacefully. So, beginning with Herodotus and running through a whole series of Greek historians down into the Hellenistic period, there are different Greek versions of the story where Cyrus besieges or has a battle or reroutes a river to get inside the walls of Babylon. And there's no evidence for any of them. There's no evidence for a battle at Babylon in this time period. So we're forced to assume that Cyrus's account of the events in all of his documents is mostly correct, and that it was a mostly peaceful conquest of one of the most famous cities of the ancient world. And the Cyrus Cylinder possibly provides a hint as to how that happened. In a fragmentary piece of the Cylinder, we know that it was edited by the priests of Marduk, the priesthood that was neglected under Nabonidus. And since they're the ones writing and creating this document in support of Cyrus and really playing up how he is favored by Marduk in the text, the theory has been, basically since the Cylinder was first translated, that Cyrus had allies inside the city, especially within the priesthood of Marduk, that acted as a kind of fifth column and helped depose the unpopular sitting Babylonian king, allowing Cyrus's forces to enter the city. And the Cyrus Cylinder makes it a very clear statement that Cyrus himself did not lead troops into the city in the first place, but instead waited outside the city for 2 weeks while his generals settled things in Babylon before Cyrus entered with parades and fanfare to receive surrender from all of the Babylonian vassals and do dedications at the Temple of Marduk. But he made a point of not entering the city himself as the conqueror and instead coming in later as a legitimate Babylonian king.
Just to be sure, that basically is the narrative on the Cyrus Cylinder then? Or is there...
Yes, from after Opus, after the battle that we have recorded. That is the historical narrative of the Cyrus Cylinder. That's only part of the text. There's a large section of the text is primarily dedicated to setting up Cyrus as the chosen king of the god Marduk. It's very reiterative. It's mostly about events that are also described elsewhere of how Nabonidus neglected the temple and how Nabonidus was forsaken by Marduk, and Marduk looked all over the world at all of the kings, and he chose Cyrus in particular, and he led Cyrus to Babylon. And that's, I would say, maybe a third of the text, is different iterations of saying that Cyrus was the chosen king of the god Marduk.
Yeah, which I guess leans to a question for me of, well, to what extent is this an innovative move? Because as we've mentioned, in one sense, there is no real precedent for an outsider declaring themselves king of Babylon. At the same time, the Neo Babylonian Empire, rather, was, well, as the name suggests, actually pretty new and pretty short-lived. I mean, were Cyrus's appeals to Marduk kind of a new form of legitimation, or did they consciously or otherwise build on earlier Babylonian precedents?
They not at all new. Even before the Neo-Babylonian period, cylinders from the Assyrian kings like Ashurbanipal also invoke Marduk. The style and the religious invocations of the Cyrus cylinder are extremely rote. They are the format that had been used for literal thousands of years up to that point. The inclusion of a detailed historical narrative within that context is somewhat unique. There's only a few examples of that, but the religious segments are fairly standard.
And do we have other examples from Cyrus's empire of these sorts of specific appeals to what seem to have been basically civic deities as a means of demonstrating legitimacy to particular populations? Or is part of what makes the Cyrus cylinder so interesting that it is one of the only surviving examples?
It is by far the most detailed such example from the Achaemenid period. We know that the cylinder tradition wasn't abandoned during this period because we have one from Antiochus I in the Seleucid Empire a few centuries later. It's quite likely, we know that from inscribed bricks, which were the more public-facing version of this, you would have a short inscription saying, "I am the king, I built this temple," sometimes with a date, sometimes not. We have those from other Achaemenid Persian kings. We don't have other cylinders like this. That's not to say they don't exist or have never existed, just that we haven't found them. We also have some similar concepts from Egypt. Again, lots of inscriptions and hieroglyphs. "I am the king, I built this temple, I raised the funds," or something like that. And then from Cyrus's son, we have a very prominent stele that shows him participating in an Egyptian ritual of installing a new Apis bull. Which is, that particular stele is quite well known in Achaemenid Persian studies because it outright refutes a story from Herodotus and kind of proves that some of Herodotus' stories about Cambyses weren't true. But we don't have very many long, detailed, and intact texts like the Cyrus cylinder, which is one of the reasons that it's very unique. It's also very unique because it's from the reign of Cyrus. It is by far the longest document about his reign and one of the only documents from Persian territory under Cyrus the Great.
Which leads into its own interesting question, because, well, we often speak of a kind of homogenous conception of, quote-unquote, the Persian Empire that includes a variety of different states interrupted in the middle by a period of Greek rule. To what extent did Cyrus, in his rule, and this is moving a little bit beyond Cylinder, I understand, resemble later kings, even within what we term the Achaemenid period, so between Cyrus and eventually Alexander? And how does the cylinder, I guess, fit into that?
So anything about the Achaemenid period is a little difficult to quantify in that the Cyrus cylinder is treated as a core document to explain Achaemenid relations with their subject peoples. So most discussions of how the Achaemenids ruled their empire include framing Achaemenid history in terms of the Cyrus Cylinder. And there's nothing necessarily to refute that, but just because of the scarcity of evidence, we don't know the degree to which his successors always interacted with their subjects in the same way that Cyrus did. Cyrus, in particular, as the founder and the conqueror, was in a much more tenuous position. And in fact, just a few decades later, or not even a few decades, about 17 years later, his empire fractured for a year into many little pieces as different conquered areas tried to reassert their independence when Darius the Great came to the throne via coup. So Cyrus had to personally invest more into appealing to his subject peoples. And I mentioned the stele from Cambyses participating in the Apis Bowl ceremony in Egypt. You see Cambyses doing some of the same things in his conquest. On the other hand, Cambyses also starts a policy of very harsh retribution against rebels. And Cyrus the Great, to a degree, did this as well. Herodotus records his conquest of the Ionian Greek cities in Anatolia, or rather one of his generals' conquests there. And those conquests are presented as very harsh. And the interpretation from historians of the Persians is usually that because they had previously been subjects of Lydia, which had been conquered and surrendered to Cyrus, when they refused to come peacefully with Lydia, they were treated as rebels. You could also see it as they never came peacefully in the first place, so it was still conquest outright. And that's an issue that is reflected repeatedly in Persian interactions with Greece of what exactly counts as being brought into the empire. After Cambyses, and after the civil war that I mentioned, after Darius has his coup, you have a shift in policy once the dynasty is on more stable footing, and rebellions are treated much more harshly. Not those initial rebellions necessarily surrounding Darius's rise to power, but anything after that is treated with harsh retribution. The beginning of the reign of Xerxes is fairly well known for a series of rebellions in Babylon and Egypt where the walls of Babylon are dismantled, and the prominent noble families of both former kingdoms suddenly drop out of the historical record. A lot of archives that had previously been maintained for generations by these existing native families suddenly come to an end around the beginning of Xerxes' reign. And that's probably indicative of some kind of change in the status quo, reflecting those rebellions. Beyond that, the record gets a lot scarcer, especially in lieu of the more detailed Greek records, but also the Persians after Xerxes are just the people in charge, and they have been for 100 years at that point. So there's less concept of independent subject peoples, and you see fewer rebellions outside of Egypt, which always maintains this hard independent streak and eventually does regain its independence at least once.
Yeah, and sticking on this and tying into this a little bit, there's kind of a bit of a question of whether there is a dynastic continuity that stretches from Cyrus into Darius and the later Persian kings, isn't there? Because I've heard at least that there is some use now of Taisbit to refer to Cyrus and Cambyses as opposed to Achaemenid. I guess as a bit of a tangent, to be fair, what's kind of the basis for this?
Yes, so this comes from Darius's reign, which gets to a different ancient Persian document, probably the first ancient Persian document, the Behistun inscription. And unlike the Cyrus Cylinder, which was buried in the foundations of a temple and maybe read by some priests. The Behistun inscription was carved into a mountainside with a giant artistic relief showing King Darius and his closest advisors lording over conquered rebels and from the subject peoples, and standing on the head of who Darius presents as the Magi Gomata. And according to Darius, whose story is repeated in different versions by various Greek authors, Gomata was involved in the assassination of Cyrus's younger son Bardia, and then was able to replace Bardia on the throne and pretend to be Bardia, and use that position to usurp Cambyses while Cambyses was in Egypt. Cambyses died, apparently of natural causes, on his way home from Egypt to address this problem. Obviously, he's going back to redress his rebellious brothers, so there's some debate. Well, was it really of natural causes? But none of the source material necessarily disagrees with that, and accidents do happen in the ancient world. Darius then assassinates the person claiming to be Bardia, and lots of modern historians think that it was probably Bardia himself, and this Gomata character was invented so that Darius wasn't outright committing regicide to take the throne. But then Darius finds himself in a bit of a bind. He has to legitimize himself, much like Cyrus had to legitimize himself as king of Babylon, and doesn't have a great connection to the throne. Now, I don't necessarily doubt the genealogy that Darius presents in his propaganda, and this is the genealogy that is presented by all of Darius's descendants down to the end of his empire. Darius presents himself as a fourth cousin of Cyrus the Great. And as seeking legitimacy goes, that's a pretty loose connection. But it's just enough to say, I'm part of the royal family, I do have some kind of connection to the throne. And what Darius did that might have given him an edge is that he reframes the genealogy that Cyrus presents in the Cyrus Cylinder with one extra generation. Cyrus says, I am Cyrus, the son of Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, the son of Thaspes. And that's where that Thaspid label comes from, is that Thaspes is the earliest ancestor presented by Cyrus. Darius traces that back one step further and says that Thaspes was the son of Achaemenid, which is where we get the name Achaemenid from, and then suggests that Thaspes had two sons and Darius comes from the other line that didn't lead down to Cyrus. But this could suggest that Darius is saying that he comes from a branch of the family that traces itself further back to this Achaemenid figure, who's basically only known from these genealogical lists. The other interpretation is that Cyrus the Great would also have traced his genealogy back to Achaemenid in Persia, but was presenting himself as a king of Anshan in the Cyrus Cylinder. Anshan was probably the primary city in Cyrus's original territory and had, at least at one point in the distant past, been a very prominent city of the Elamite kingdom, which had been the Bronze Age and early Iron Age power in southern Iran. Elam had been invading and being invaded by Mesopotamia since the dawn of recorded history. If you go to the Sumerian king list, there's a brief reference to kings of Awan who invaded southern Mesopotamia and ruled there for a few decades and then were kicked out by one of the many other dynasties at the time. So that's a very long and established history that educated Babylonians would have been familiar with in some degree. The title King of Susa and Anshan was the standard title for, that you would equate to Elamite emperor, great king of Elam. So it's possible that Cyrus was trying to legitimize himself in terms of Babylon by only tracing himself as far back as his first ancestor to take the title King of Anshan. The other possibility is that Cyrus had no idea who this Achaemenid guy was, and Darius just grafted himself onto the family tree, and there's really no way to know. Forever after, everybody seems to have just accepted Darius's version of the story pretty uncritically, until you get to some later Greek and Roman commentators who think Herodotus made it up, but we have this giant inscription on a mountainside in Persia to tell us that Herodotus was at least working off of some original story, and that inscription was, again, copied and distributed to other places in the empire. So which version of the story you want to go with really depends on your opinion of Darius at the end of the day. There's not great historical evidence one way or the other, but Darius says that everybody was an Achaemenid, so it's convenient to politically lump them all together as Achaemenids.
And speaking of political conveniences, I think one thing you stress in some answers on the subreddit about the Cyrus Cylinder is that a lot of the way that it's talked about in modern days, primarily in popular rather than academic discourse, does have a lot of political dimensions to it. And so kind of skipping ahead over 2.5 millennia now, to when the cylinder was rediscovered and what came after, I guess, how has the cylinder been reinterpreted since its rediscovery, and what are the pitfalls of that?
So when it was first discovered in 1879, and then subsequently translated, the primary alternative use for the cylinder was as biblical verification. And there's some truth to this. It does bear some pretty striking resemblances, especially to a passage in Isaiah 41, where the prophet Isaiah, or as historians view it, the second prophet Isaiah, is discussing how Cyrus has liberated the Jews from the Babylonian captivity and is allowing them to return to Babylon. And this is substantiated by other books in the Bible and by just the fact that a Jewish kingdom did suddenly reappear in Judea around the time that Cyrus the Great took over the territory. The passage from Isaiah has some similar language to the Cyrus Cylinder, and that same language was later incorporated into the discussion of the prophetic Messiah, Messiah in Hebrew just coming from a word that means anointed one. So Cyrus was portrayed as the anointed one of the Hebrew God at a time when several people up to that point had been called Messiah. It wasn't the prophetic term that we imagine now. And the Cyrus Cylinder contains some things that could refer to policies like that. There's a section of the Cyrus Cylinder that talks about how he allowed people and gods to return to their cities. And in the context of the Cyrus Cylinder, this is entirely focused on the southern Tigris region. It's probably referring to idols taken into the city by Nabonidus in the buildup to Cyrus's invasion. But in a wider context, or at least a similar related policy, Cyrus did allow Hebrew people to return to Judea with artifacts that the Babylonians had looted from their temple. So we know that the policy existed. Whether or not it's related to the Cyrus Cylinder is up for debate. There's not a lot to substantiate it. But it is another piece of evidence that Cyrus was more than happy to support local religions prospering and rebuilding their own temples. Then, fast forward to 1963, and all of a sudden, the Cyrus Cylinder becomes significantly more relevant to the nation of Iran for the first time, really ever. And this is something that is kind of left out of modern Iranian discussions of the Cyrus Cylinder. It's not from Iran. It's from Babylon. It's from... it was discovered in what's now Iraq, which is why you never see much Cyrus Cylinder in discussions of repatriation, because it's about an Iranian, it's from Iraq, was entirely legitimately excavated by an Assyrian for the British Museum under the Ottomans. There's a lot of provenance to it that complicates that sort of discussion. But in 1963, the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, launched a series of reforms that he called the White Revolution. And this was the culmination of really all of his experiences up to that point, including a coup and counter-coup in 1953 with CIA involvement, quite famously. After that coup, the Shah was obviously concerned about his political situation because he had briefly been exiled from his own country, and started trying to implement some of the popular reforms domestically that he thought he needed to stay in power that had been successful for some of his rivals. But he was also very concerned for the entirety of his reign with avoiding foreign intervention. And this was due in large part to the fact that he came to power through foreign intervention when his father was ousted by a USSR-UK joint invasion at the outset of World War II. He spent most of his reign trying to do a balancing act between the Soviet bloc and the NATO bloc, but gradually became more and more allied with the West over the course of the Cold War because Soviet aggression within Iran. Obviously, the Soviets were closer to Iran, had more geographic interests in the area. So he starts implementing all of these policies to try and make himself more appealing in the West, and one of those was in his book explaining his White Revolution. He declared the Cyrus Cylinder to be the first document of human rights. There's absolutely nothing at all in the cylinders to support this. I need to lead with that in this discussion. The Cyrus Cylinder is an ancient Mesopotamian document through and through, based on very standard Babylonian practices at the time. It's not particularly innovative in any way. That didn't stop the Shah from calling it a declaration of human rights. In his book in 1967, he sent it to the UN in 1968, and then in 1971, his daughter presented a replica of the cylinder to the United Nations, which is still there in the building in New York, and it is still officially recognized to this day by the United Nations as the first declaration of human rights, despite the fact that absolutely none of the text supports that claim. This has led to the UN being treated as a reputable source, and the claim that the cylinder is something to do with human rights spreading sourced and unsourced for the last 40 years. The Shah also made tying himself and his monarchy to the Achaemenid monarchy a key point in his political self-portrayal in the 1970s. In 1971, he hosted a 2,500-year celebration of Iranian monarchy, basing that date off of Cyrus's conquest of Babylon. And this was due in part to a long-standing nationalist trend in Iran that treated the pre-Islamic period as somehow more secular and more modern than the post-Arab invasion Islamic medieval period. This is not necessarily true. They might have been Zoroastrian rather than Muslim, but the pre-Islamic Iranian kings were very openly religious, had religious policies that they implemented in their territory, but that was the perception of the pre-Islamic period in Iranian nationalism at the time, and it represented very intentionally this trend towards secularization and modernization and westernization that eventually led to some of the backlash of the 1979 revolution. Part of what allowed this bizarre misconstruction of the Cyrus Cylinder under the last Shah was that when he first made the declaration, a large chunk of the cylinder was missing. When it was excavated by Rassam in 1879, a part of the cylinder that we call Fragment B was broken off. And sometime, either just before or just after the Shah started calling it a Declaration of Human Rights, a fake translation of Fragment B started circulating and worked its way onto the internet basically as soon as the internet existed, and has circulated there ever since. And this is where you get things like the idea that Cyrus provided unalienable rights to his subjects or abolished slavery. It's all part of this fake translation. And if you read the fake translation side by side with the real original part of Fragment A, it doesn't read like it's part of the same document. For one, all of a sudden there are no lacunas, there's no damage to the text. He starts talking about the Persian god Ahura Mazda instead of the Babylonian god Marduk. And the language changes to something very clearly written by a modern person working with modern vocabulary. But that translation remains a bane for Persian studies up to present, because combined with UN endorsement of the last Shah's talking points, it's basically impossible to stamp something like that out on the internet. But the actual text of Fragment B is extremely boring. It's mostly talking about Cyrus's building projects and a final dedication to Marduk before it's buried.
Well, even so, however many people this podcast reaches will hopefully at least be aware and will come out better informed about actually what does the Cyrus Cylinder say and so on. So thank you for coming on, and we hope to see you again soon.
Yes, thank you for having me. Always happy to come on and talk about ancient Persia.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.